My name is Peter Caughey. I'm from Forest Rock Qigong, and I have a very special guest today, and it's another Peter, and it's Pete Larkin from New Zealand, and he's a specialist in neuroscience and neuropuncture. And we're going to talk about traditional Chinese medicine today, and we're going to talk a little bit about how the neuroscience and the acupuncture overlay each other. It's a very useful piece of information. So welcome, Pete. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's great to be here, Pete.
Yeah, very good. Cheers. So Pete and I go back for a long time. We've been friends for a long time. We both were teaching in the New Zealand School of Acupuncture for many years ago. Pete might be able to remember the exact years ago, how long ago it was. And we were teaching
quite a long time ago now.
Yeah, and we were teaching two different schools. I was teaching in the Auckland school, and he was teaching in the Wellington school. And we were teaching similar subjects, but Pete was doing all the anatomy and physiology as well. We were both teaching the Qigong and part of the degree in New Zealand school. And so we become friends then. We used to go and meet each other, and we used to have encounters. We used to go and visit each other and talk about our classes, and because we were doing the same program for both of them, and talk about what was coming up for us in the classes, and then we used to train together, and so we become really close friends. And we both had come from different Qigong backgrounds and Tai Chi backgrounds as well, and so we got to talk to each other about and train together, which was so much fun. I used to really enjoy catching up with Pete. It was fun. I'm not sure what it was like for you, but I really enjoyed our time.
Well, my experience of it was, I was sort of a freshman, I suppose, if you're thinking about the time of my life, pretty early 20s. I was probably in that stage where I was smorgasbording more systems than what I needed, to be fair. But I remember going to Olatunji, our mutual friend and the founder of the acupuncture school in New Zealand. And I'd say to him, I really want to talk about the micro-orbit or Dantian sort of dynamics or something like this. And he was like, you need to go see the Qigong guy in Auckland, the other Pete, he called you. And so he put me on a plane and sent me up to Auckland, and we bumped into you. I think it was on a Sunday, actually, maybe up at the school. And we got there and got into our training, started swapping systems, which was really cool because, as you alluded to, I came from the Yang style Tai Chi system, had a variety of different Qigong systems and Bagua under my belt. And you came from a really different tradition. And so it was really insightful for me. And to be fair, when I first met you, Pete, I was pretty scared of you. It's big SAS dude from Auckland, but pretty quickly discovered, our mutual interest and friendship. And I think it's been about 22 years, maybe now, maybe a little bit longer, since we first had those first encounters.
That's very cool, Pete. Yeah, see, I knew you'd be able to remember the time. My memory's not that good when it comes to time. Yeah, it's been a long time, and I've really valued our friendship, and we've stayed friends the whole way through that. And we've always been passing notes. When we have a conversation, it usually goes on for a long time because we're passionate about what we do, and we have a very a similar outlook on life and what we do, and our goal in life, and how we help people, and how we spread the word of this into the world. We're very similar, so we have a lot to share with it. So that's what I thought was a very valuable thing for us to do today. We're together. Yeah. And it's been a pleasure. And so Pete's also been coming out to Bali and been part of the 200-hour Qigong teachers training. And he's been right from the start, from the very, very first one we did. And I've kept in contact, and we've been doing that. And so we catch up every year and spend some time together, which is really fantastic. And which we'll talk a little bit about that later anyway.
Oh.
So Pete, I'd like you to introduce yourself. Now I can go on about your history and what you do and how you do it, but I think you're going to be way better at describing your passion in your life. I mean, it's easier from you. It sounds better than me praising you, as much as I would like to praise, because I always like to praise you. But I think it's really nice if you talk about yourself and where you come from and about the neuroscience and things. How's that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate the praise. Thank you very much. I'm not overly good at receiving it, to be fair. It's not one of my stronger suits. But my journey in medicine is it's all I've ever done. my entire adult life actually is practice of Chinese medicine, so it's all I really know. But I started my journey in my late teens, mainly through illness, and my entry point there was suffering from an autoimmune issues that were really affecting the endothelial tissues, my skin, and my body. So I was, chronically fatigued, chronically depressed, very much in pain all the time, particularly with my skin condition. And although, my experience in Western medicine at the time was the use of immune suppressant drugs as the primary vehicle for treatment, I was pretty aware that at that point, when I did a bit of research about it, that there was really no known cure for autoimmunity. And what I was doing from a pharmaceutical perspective was really treating the symptoms, not the root. So I started to seek out options for different ways of viewing, or different paradigms, I suppose, for viewing our body and our health and well-being and our relationship with our environment. And so that started for me, particularly with breath work. As an asthmatic as well, I was, interested in trying to really enhance my respiratory function, and it seemed like a good area to go to. So I found a Qigong class, which was basically full of all of these old ladies that had lots of arthritis, and they were like, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, I don't want to end up like that. And so I started doing a bit of breath work and Qigong, and my first Qigong experience was pretty profound, actually. I started off with the 5-element system, which is one of the first ones that we now teach on the 200 hour, and a really great foundational system actually for people to begin with, because it only has 5 movement features to it. But I remember coming back from one of my first classes and just sort of thinking to myself, why hasn't anyone taught me how to breathe before? I've had this whole life of respiratory dysfunction and autoimmunity, and no one's ever mentioned that you can actually control your breathing and improve it. So it was a sort of a light switch moment, I suppose. And so I started really investigating Taoist practices, particularly in breath work. And that led me to obviously exploring the martial arts. And although I did quite a lot of external martial arts initially, because of my condition and health status, I wasn't able to really sustain many of those practices because of the friction on my skin. It would cause me a lot of problems. The sort of overheating of my body with some of the more physical practices like Shaolin as an example. And so Tai Chi Chuan was quite attractive to me because of its softness, its fluidity, and its gentleness on my body, which I could sustain. So I pretty quickly fell into the interest of Tai Chi and Qigong through those health-related challenges. And to cut a long story short, after going through to several different clubs and what have you, I stumbled across Olatunji, more commonly known as Tunji, in Wellington when I was 19, going 20. And the story is sort of amusing because I was actually dating a girl who went up to the acupuncture school for a treatment, and she fainted during the treatment. And so I got a phone call at work saying, "Oh, your girlfriend's passed out from this treatment. Can you come and pick her up?" And I was like, "What is going on here?" So I went along, and that was my introduction to the fact that there was even an acupuncture school in New Zealand. I had no idea of that. This predates social media advertising these things at you. And there was this big Nigerian character, Olatunji, and all his grandeur sort of standing there in the clinic. And I was like, "Oh, this place is fascinating. I'm really interested in Taoism and Tai Chi. I've been practicing Tai Chi for quite a long time." And he was like, "Oh, that's interesting. Why don't you show me your form?" Took me into a room out the back, and I did, got about halfway through the first sequence of the Tai Chi form, and he was just like, "No, it's all wrong," pretty much straight away. And then sat me down and showed me the Young style 108 long form. It was the only time in the 20 years that I knew Olatunji that he ever demonstrated the form to me. It was that first time. So I was actually quite lucky to see that, because I think it was a rarity at that stage of his career for him to really demonstrate the forms. But for whatever reason, on that day, he showed it to me, and my jaw just dropped. I knew immediately I was in the presence of a master at that point, and spent the rest of that year studying with him sort of 2-3 times a week, going to his Aikido classes, doing Tai Chi, just trying to get into his pocket. Enrolled at the acupuncture school, and then started my acupuncture degree a year later. It was about 2 years into that process where the opportunity to take a role teaching Tai Chi and Qigong at the school came up. And Tunji approached me and said, "Do you want to teach? I think you'd be really good at it." And I was like, "No way. I'm way too young to be teaching this. I'm only in the second year of my, finished the second year of my Tai Chi Qigong diploma. I don't feel confident to do that." And he said to me, "Don't worry. You only need to be one step ahead of your students, and I'll make sure that that happens." I was like, okay, well, this is an opportunity to maybe get some private training. At which point, when I started berating him with questions about Qigong, and particularly the energetic body, how to visualize this, he would give me statements like, "Get a notebook, write it down, and ask me in 13 years, just keep practicing." And after a while of probably getting pretty frustrated with the earlier version of me, berating him with all these complex questions, he said, "You need to go to Auckland and meet the Qigong guy, the other Pete," which Tunji kindly put me on a plane, flew me up for our first meeting, whereby you took me through the initiation process into the Forest Rock community, took me through the philosophy of the monastery system, and we started our trading process where we were swapping a whole plethora of Qigong systems, and then working on developing at the time, the Taiji Qigong diploma that was available. And that was the beginning of our sort of relationship and my mentorship under you, Peter, which again was, I just couldn't believe what was sort of going on in my life. I basically stumbled through serendipity into this great Taiji master. He then started introducing me to other ones, including Dr. Yan as well. And I sort of considered that my time in the monastery, as it were, where I just really went deep, trained extensively for several years under yourself, Dr. Yan and Olatunji, and started to build my teaching chops up at the acupuncture school. And I think I taught there for about 12 years, almost 13 years all up, which was a great initial career for me in medicine, because it allowed me to sort of continue research, move through and do my master's program, and develop my acupuncture clinical skill set. And it was during that time that Tunji told me that his life goal was to have an acupuncturist in every primary medical care centre in New Zealand, and to bring acupuncture out of the periphery of where it was sort of sitting in New Zealand, and bring it right in central to our healthcare modalities here in this country. And to achieve that, he was well aware that we needed to be better at communicating the mechanisms of acupuncture and from a biomedical perspective, and to enhance our ability to research acupuncture modalities. And in his effort to do that, he created the degree program that then sort of opened up a research wing, which other great minds like Deborah Betts and Kate Roberts were heavily involved with at the time. And we started to see this evolution of acupuncture being sort of looked into from a mechanistic perspective. And that's where my interest in bioelectrics started to come in. I came across a research article looking at the stimulation of yin tongue in Do 20, pretty classical Chinese medical units for acupuncture stimulation, utilizing an electrical device on it. And I was like, what's this? This is interesting. And it was at the beginning of the sort of functional MRI research where they were starting to really look at the brain on acupuncture. and giving us a little bit of an insight into what are the neurophysiological mechanisms of acupuncture on the human organism. And in reading that research and starting to do it on myself, I was like, wow, this is a very novel application. And I had been introduced to electrical acupuncture in my training. I certainly had seen it in my travels overseas as well. But realistically, we didn't really knew what we were doing with the devices or anything about it. And so I decided that I would go really deep into this electrical acupuncture arena. And because of my interest in anatomy, physiology, and the nervous system that had been fostered through my previous education, it seemed like a pretty good combination where we could take what we already knew from a traditional Chinese medical perspective, but to start to really to deeply research it from a modern 21st century biomedical perspective. Because you can't get around the fact that when they named areas like Anmian, like peaceful mind, or Shinmin, spirit gate, or Yin Tang, spirit hall, they were naming these units or areas of the body that they were needling into and expressing some type of functionality that it had. And that's what's happening, over 2,500 years ago. And when I read the classical texts like Ling Shu through the lens of neuroscience, what I see is an amazingly astute understanding of anatomy, physiology, and functionality of how the body is responding to this acupuncture stimulus with the sort of worldview that they had at the time. And so what we started to do was really research specific units like Yin Tang and start to really think about how is that communicating with the nervous system and creating the benefits that we see in clinic through this neuroscientific lens. And in doing that, you can't research electrical acupuncture in New Zealand or anywhere in the world without coming across the work of Dr. Michael Corradino, who wrote the first ever manual on what we call neuropuncture, this sort of view of the acupuncture modality from a 21st century medical mindset. So I read his book and started to train online with him. And we brought him out to New Zealand for a sort of an initial workshop, 3-day workshop where we started to train in the use of these electrical techniques. And much like my experience of meeting you and Tunji, I immediately felt like I was in the room with someone that I was going to be mentored by and build a good relationship with. And so in that context, I then started to work on my doctoral of neuroscience acupuncture, which has been quite a long process with a little few COVID breaks, and that has included multiple cadaver dissections of the human organism. I've particularly focused on the cranial nerve distribution, the neck, and the spinal column with those techniques in the brain, to advance novel strategies for being able to bring needles into the body and to investigate exactly what the neuroanatomical mechanisms of acupuncture are. So I've been working through that process now, and I'm just at the tail end of my doctoral, and I'm specializing in traumatic brain injury. Anyone who knows New Zealanders will be aware of our famous All Blacks rugby team. Unfortunately, traumatic brain injury is a big problem globally. But to give appreciation, in New Zealand, about 35,000 mild traumatic brain injuries happen a year, and about 2,200 of those will actually see a primary care provider. And importantly, the things that we learnt, like, you'll be fine in 21 days, get back into it, are inherently not true. And in many ways, a traumatic brain injury can, for some populations, become a neurodegenerative disease and cause ongoing changes throughout their life. And so my interest is, how do we treat traumatic brain injury, particularly in the acute phase, and the mechanisms of acupuncture on that, because acupuncture has some quite interesting mechanisms that are well suited to traumatic brain injury? And then how do we particularly ameliorate some of the more progressive changes that happen in post-concussion syndromes? And my interest is quite specifically within the cognitive and mental emotional spheres of those injuries, which unfortunately are massively underestimated and often poorly treated. And because of the way acupuncture does work and what we know about that, we can apply those mechanisms quite specifically to some of those effects. For example, improving sleep and awake cycling, enhancing your ability to envelope and focus your attention, which is a big issue after traumatic brain injuries, and actually heal the brain in the context of some of the inflammatory and structural changes that take place in the brain after an injury. And through that work, I also became a neuropuncture instructor and currently lecture throughout the Southern Hemisphere and America on a variety of topics. And this year we're focusing on long COVID, which there is a big problem globally, about 65 million cases reported to date. And that'll be the tip of the iceberg, to be fair. Functional neurological disorder, which is a very fascinating lens to look at chronic fatigue syndromes through, and Parkinson's. And believe it or not, there is quite an interesting connection between long COVID and neurodegenerative diseases, which we'll be sharing with that. And I'll also be teaching my traumatic brain injury and migraine module this year too. So that's a little bit about my sort of journey, where it started and where I've ended up. And ultimately speaking, through that time, my good friend Pete Caughey here has been a great advocate for this work, and has really put me onto the stage for my interest in sharing my understanding about neuroscience from a Qigong perspective, because ultimately speaking, Qigong has widespread positive functional restorative mechanisms, right from everything through cardiovascular health, right through to structural and pain medicine, cognitive and mental health. And my interest has really been in, again, understanding, not just from a traditional Chinese medical perspective, how that works, but understanding how do we view that through a neuroscientific lens, and hence the teaching that we've been doing on the 200-hour training to help educate people around that, enhance communication skills from a biomedical perspective, and to understand the impact that Qigong has on the nervous system, and both in the periphery and in the brain, which is just, well, to me, absolutely fascinating. And I'm happy to dive in and answer any questions about that.
Very good, Pete. So thanks for your introduction. That's very cool. And there was a few things came up while you were talking, which I thought was fascinating. And I know they did there's a documentary on I can't remember what media it's on, but there's a documentary about the brain injuries from Gridiron in America and how it's affecting people afterwards. And they even wear helmets, and they still have this long-term injury coming from it, and a lot. Like it was a big figure. These people are really hurting themselves. So it's really great what you're doing. And I think you're understanding. I have incredible support and passion for you, for your dedication to understanding more about how the neuro pathways work, how the mind works, how the brain functions. I think it's fascinating that you put a needle in one point, and you can, because now with the MIRs, you can actually watch the brain, which part of the brain it actually triggers, and what actually happens when that happens. And so now it's not just put a needle in and it goes into the meridian and does this. Now we put the needle in and we can watch the response it has inside our mental center of our body, and how it's creating change inside the body, and you can record it. And you can record and watch what center it does in some of these points. I mean, your language is way more precise around this in medical terms, which I really love that too. Mine's very based on Chinese medicine, but you have to speak the biomedicine language so well, and I think it's a really great thing you do, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating that there's such a response from a needle, and they learned this, thousands of years ago when they didn't know this. They weren't dissecting people and finding out what nerves went to where and where they went. This is a new thing, and so it's a great doorway into watching what the functionality happens when you insert needles. And when you insert needles
Yeah,
and you
nice.
insert them in your tongue, and what actually happens inside the brain and whatever happens in the pathways and how it's affecting the whole body. I think it's an incredible
I
study and
think
I really love it.
the classical texts, interesting, are full of little hints about the neuroanatomy. Interestingly, like in the Huangdi Neijing, it says that if the dachi sensation is not felt, the treatment is rendered useless.
Mm.
And so they had an awareness that there needed to be a feeling that was a certain response from the needle for an effect to take place. And they would comment on that needle being grasped by the chi, like a sort of like the needle being pinched in, or a sensation there. And when we think about the Da Chi model, this concept that there needs to be a sensation, that's a hint to us that there's something about the feeling of having the acupuncture needle in the body that was deemed to be very important right back in the antiquity of Chinese medicine. And certainly we've utilized that Da Chi model to try and understand what were they thinking there? Why did they think sensation was important? Firstly, they would have noticed that things like pain reduction, like the patient just reporting, I feel less pain, was probably congruent with getting a nice bit of a dull, achy sensation on the tip of the needle. And there are multiple manipulations of the needles to achieve that. Lifting and thrusting, siphoning, picking techniques, all these different classical ways of communicating with these what we call functional acu nodes, or pressure points in the classical sort of translations.
I
So I
think it's
actually
great.
think that there's an interesting and powerful connection that we can make right from the earliest classical texts that can actually give us clues as to what to look for. As I was saying, like the naming that they used was very, very fascinating, because unlike biomedicine, where they just named things after the person who found it, right? Like inside the ear, they have this nerve called Arnold's nerve. Well, some dude Arnold found that when he was dissecting some people, and he was like, I'll name it after me. In the tradition, they named them with these functional names, like Shinmin, spirit gate. And if we translate that, we start to sort of think, oh, wait a minute, they must think that that area has some important functionality for the mind and the spirit. And so therefore, when we're starting to research these functional nodes and sort of think, well, what could that be? Why would that work? We've already got a path, a trail there that we can sort of look into. And the classical descriptions of the functionality, a good example is on the side of the leg. There's a classical point called Yin Ling Chuan, and it was classically associated with tremor and rigidity, a command point of the sinews that was seen to relax the body, reduce rigidity and reduce tremor. Well, firstly, stiffness, rigidity, postural change, and tremor, that was probably Parkinson's that they were looking at in the context of what we would now know. And they found that needling that area was reducing that effect on the human organism. And so therefore we can go to that area and start to think about how would that work? What could that be working in within the nervous system, and how would we understand that? And then we can start to research that through that sort of neuroanatomical lens. And of course, what we find to be consistently true is that when we look at a classical unit like Yangling Chuan, its description of its functionality, and then we research that in the context of how that might work in a clinical setting and the function inside the human organism, what we found was that it had effect on stimulating dopamine neurons in the midbrain that decay and die in Parkinson's. And so therefore, they didn't understand the brain in that way, but they certainly understood that stimulating and bringing a needle into the body, into certain areas, produced an effect that would ameliorate those symptoms. And the naming and the functionality of the points gives us clues about that. So I often like to point out to people, although I will talk often from a neuroscientific perspective, I think it's really important for people to understand that what we're doing there is actually taking information from the classics and just simply trying to understand how would that work from a modern 21st century biomedical perspective. And we consistently find answers there all the time that make great anatomical sense. And therefore, in the context of the building of a research literature, being able to achieve Tunji's goal of bringing acupuncture into primary care settings, we've been able to really understand, a lot more about these amazing classical approaches to healthcare and how we now can sort of view them from a 21st century medical perspective. So I think we can build a bridge there that sort of brings these two worlds together, and importantly, that does and has led to more use of acupuncture in primary care, particularly in things like pain medicine and neurological disorders.
Yeah, that's great, and I totally agree. I think so I've gone off at another part of that as well with talking about the points. So when we have a point in a say Shen Men, well, I've also gone into the original Chinese characters because the characters have been interpreted into English words. And they call it spirit gate. But the Chinese character don't necessarily mean that. That's just an interpretation of what the character is. So I've gone back into the characters of these points to find out all the different strokes and what all the different strokes mean to make up one part of the character and what that actually really means. And then go to another character and break the character down into all the pieces, because the characters are like little stories. They're like stories. You can't. A lot of characters. There's no one word to describe that character. It's a concept, and so we give it a one word name because we can't understand trying to. You can't talk in a concept. And so they had a concept and a concept. Put both concepts together, comes to that, and then it comes to what that point is. But we just call it spirit gate. And we're open to interpretation what that means, but you can actually go deeper into the original Chinese character, the traditional character,
Absolutely.
and discover the poetry and the meaning behind it. It's just absolutely there's just magic, because there was all the physical, mental, spiritual aspect behind it. They understood it so deeply in the human function in such an incredible way to name it that, to understand, because what they were doing, they were telling people what the true essence of what that point does and how it affects the body on a true essence on all levels. And even on, as I say, even on the spiritual level, how it affected people. And I'm fascinated by learning that way. And of course, they knew what it did by functionality in the body. And I just want to talk to that about, they didn't do randomized control studies, but what they did was case studies. And so they put their point in, and they had 10,000 case studies of the same point. If you put that point in, this is the result you get. If you put that point in, this is the same result you get. And so they got it on sheer numbers of results. So it's a great, case studies was such a great way of doing it. And so they shared that if I do this, we get this result without doing the study. So they base their knowledge by just sheer results on what works. If they do that, they do that. Now you've invented, well, not invented, you're involving yourself in how that's affecting the nervous system and the brain. And I think it's a fascinating direction to head off and see it in a very different way. And as I say, I went back to the name of the point and what the point really means. And it's fascinating. I'm in part of one of my courses, the level 2 teachers training course. We go back into the characters, and I go back and I break the course down, the character down so you see what it actually really means, what spirit gate really means. And it's a lot more in depth understanding of a philosophy behind that point, more than just the point and what it does functionally inside the body. There's a whole thing that goes on with that. So it's interesting. We're unraveling the mystery of traditional Chinese medicine to try and get a doorway into the mind of these people who were extraordinary human beings who understood it at this level. And then they set all this, and it hasn't changed. The name at that point's been called the same thing forever, whoever called it that point. And how what they really knew, and what they really knew how it's happening inside the body. And we're trying to unlock that in different ways to try and work out the essence of something that's been around a long time, and it's so effective and so efficient. And that's why I think both of us, we're involved in it, because it's something very special that lives inside the study of this, about the energy of the body. It's extraordinary.
You know, when I sort of started my Chinese medical training and looking into these areas of the body, we always got taught about the three treasures: the Jing, the Qi, and the Shen. And the way that it was sort of introduced to me is that you could sort of see Jing as sort of like essence, or sort of like the physical form. The Qi is like functionality, the sort of manifestation of that. And the Shen is the sort of consciousness, the spirit of that. And when you look into the descriptions of the classical units that they were utilizing, they often describe a physical effect. Oh, you know, that's going to be good for wrist pain. They often describe a functional effect. Oh, it helps people to maintain their sleep cycle. And they often describe a conscious effect. Oh, it lowers anxiety. And you can actually see them sort of mentally thinking about the structure, its function, and its effect on human consciousness. And in many ways, we can deploy exactly that same framework from a neuroscientific perspective, whereby we can think about what's happening just at the site, you know, the Jing, the actual physicality of it. While there's a, you know, a nerve and a blood vessel there, and it's going to have this mechanism locally, we can think about what's its functionality in the nervous system. So in the context of its effect on sleep, it actually stimulates melatonin production, which is the sort of starting of your sleep cycles at nighttime. And we can think about what that impact would be on our consciousness, which quite clearly, if you're sleeping well, then, you know, your mental health works better, your concentration is better. There's so many positive endpoints to that in the context of our quality of life. And so I think that unraveling the mystery, as it were, actually requires us to walk backwards into the antiquity, like you're saying, and really look at the characters and try to understand the mindset of the physicians that were sort of observing these things. And certainly when you read through the classics, you actually see other commentators commenting on previous people's work and how they observed that. And without diminishing from the magic of it, in fact, I think understanding it from a neuroscientific perspective doesn't reduce the efficacy of the traditional focus. It actually aims to describe it in a different language and give us more insight. And importantly, in that context, when we start to think about adapting technologies to enhance the functionality in the context of what we're doing with bioelectrics, it also helps us to understand how we might go about achieving that in the context of sort of where acupuncture is naturally evolved into, really from the 1940s and Jisheng Han's work when he first started applying electrical acupuncture to rabbits, through to where we are now. We are just riding the tip of a wave that has just been continually rolling in for thousands of years from the Chinese medical antiquity to where we are. I actually think what we're doing at the moment is just a very natural part of that evolution. Just going a little bit deeper into it. And obviously our ability to observe the human organism has changed a lot. You know, blood draws, you know, the X-rays, CTs, MRIs, DET scans, all the tools that we have now. And the beautiful thing about it is that every functional node that we've ever researched, the mechanism of it from a neuroscientific perspective absolutely confirms the classical functionality that they described for those units to be doing.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating that it's just beautiful. You know, I was just flabbergasted, to be fair, when I first started diving into this, and looking at yin tung and do 20, which is a classical prescription for mental health and depression. And as soon as I started seeing its effect on the brain in regards to its recruitment of dopamine neurons in the frontal cortex, I was just like, oh my God, no wonder it feels so good when you have that done. And it just confirms exactly what they described that point combination to achieve. So
It's fascinating, Pete, that
it's
they
just
knew
beautiful.
that this is what it did. So I'm fascinated by the minds and the consciousness of the people who didn't say put, but I don't even think they discovered what they did. They were trying to bring that knowledge into the world so long ago. They wanted to bring that awareness of the human body and how it functioned into the world. And they gave it such a long time, and they gave us all the clues to what they had that we really understood. But not everybody's going to understand the level that they understood it. But they gave the clues, they gave the message of, and now we're I mean, there's a lot of people who do this over the centuries have done this to try and unpack the wisdom that these guys had, or guys or girls, I'm not sure, it's not a sex thing, but the people that had that incredible insight and wisdom way back then, and to keep that alive. And now we're going even more, because now scientifically we can go into a different level of the understanding of it, but the understanding they knew, and without any studies, without anything else, they already knew this. And I find that miraculous. It's like a deity, a sage in the planet. They're very wise people that came in and brought this information into the consciousness, into the human consciousness really early. Like for thousands of years, they brought it in, and they gave us markers, they gave us the cues, they gave us the clues to the whole functionality of a human being. They gave it to us. They got it way back then. And we're still trying to unpack the wisdom that they gave us. And fascinating what you do, and how we're both trying to unlock. And so we'd never lose the thing that they gave us. They gave us a very special gift. They gave us a treasure map, and they knew what it was, and they gave it to us to try and find how we could unravel that ourselves in the modern world, and knew that this would last forever and it can keep understanding. But what did they know to start off with? That's what fascinates me, that they already knew this. And all we're doing is discovering something they already knew. And I think it's great. But I want to move on a little bit, because we can talk about this for hours, and we usually do. And so let's just talk a little bit about, because we can do this again. We can have another chat, and we can do specific things and treatments and things. So I like to do that with you, because I think it's a fascinating subject to people. But what I'd like to talk about, Pete, is what you bring to the 200 hours Qigong teachers training. What you bring, so people know what they're going to get when they come and do the neuroscience part of the course, and why you put that into a level 1 course. And because you have a level 2 part of it as well, and a level 3, but we'll just talk about the level 1, where the introduction to people into this. What do you bring into the course, so people can get a glimpse of the sort of thing that's going to happen for them during that course?
Totally. Well, when I've started my research into Qigong, I'd already been practicing for many years, maybe about 8 years, from 16 to about 24, just doing the physical practices. And I just couldn't get around the fact that certain types of practices, like the heaven and earth system is a good example of that, just altered my state of being so much. I'd come out of the practices, I would just be completely quiescent, calm and relaxed, my heart rate nice and slow and steady. And I'd just be like, man, this is having a really powerful impact on my body and my spirit. And when we learned systems like Shibashi, we had to learn the medical reasoning for why you might do a certain movement. And some of that made a lot of sense to me. Things like, skip the sea, toss the sky is going to be good for your lower back. And you could sort of see in the movement why that might be. But there were areas that I felt there were mysteries that didn't quite, I couldn't quite sort of put my finger on it. Why would it be like that? A good example of this is in the Shibashi, we often talk about the different organ systems that we might be targeting. So in a movement like Embrace the Mountain, and its effect on the lung and the heart. And I sort of thought to myself, I wonder if we can understand that more deeply those mechanisms and why it might be influencing those particular organ systems, or why something like Sage Presents Peach is indicated for enhancing sleep outcomes, as an example. And so I started to dive into the literature from an exercise sciences perspective first, because there wasn't really a lot of good research back in my early 20s when it came to specifically Qigong. You know, there was a few sort of studies around, but not a body of work that I could really dive into. And so I thought to myself, well, why don't we do it like this? I firstly thought, what are the core features of Qigong that are true to every Qigong system? Because importantly, there are thousands of them. There are so many different sort of categories and stylistic preferences. But what I found to be pretty consistent across all of the Qigong systems was postural alignment is the first core feature that you'll find in every Qigong system. Doesn't matter what one you learn, you'll be definitely guided to adjust your posture. So I was like, okay, that's a good sort of window that we can go into. The second one was breathing. Every Qigong system has you doing something with your breathing, whether it be do nothing with your breathing, like purposely trying to just let it be natural, all the way through to long, slow breathing, sort of huffing and puffing, and all sorts of different sort of breathing techniques. So I was like, okay, we've got posture, we've got breathing, they're pretty core features. The next core feature was really meditation. All of the Qigong systems have some quality of controlling your mind, whether that be holding your attention on a specific area of your body, whether that be imbuing an affirmation into your practice, or Qigong is quite visually rich in the context of visualization techniques, as an example. So I thought, well, the meditation, mind, metacognition, visualization is a wing. So I just sort of called that mind loosely. And then quite clearly movement. And that does include static, like trying to not move, and dynamic, being able to move. So I thought to myself, okay, there's these four sort of regulating methods: posture, breathing, the mentation or mental work, and the movement. And so what I decided I would do is I would study the anatomy, the physiology, and the neurosciences of those four wings. So basically, I started first of all just studying posture. What is posture? How does it break down? What's its impact on our health and well-being, both structurally and physically, but also mentally and within the brain? How do we orchestrate posture from a neuroscientific perspective, which is a surprisingly complex event, and really just sort of dissect what is posture? Once I went through all the information I could find about posture, I then went into breath work. So what is the physical functionality of breathing? How do we do it? The sort of, let's call it the neural signature of it in the context of, pardon me, the neural signature of it in the context of voluntary breathing and involuntary breathing. So the automated stuff that we just do naturally versus the controlled breathing that we can do. And then again, it's sort of physical effects on the body. How does it improve our health and well-being? So I did the posture and the breathing, and then I went through all of the parts around mentation. So meditative techniques, metacognition, sort of self-awareness techniques, visualization, which is quite a rich component of Qigong practice, sort of mindfulness and mindset, which there's an amazing literature coming out around mindsets now, which is really important for us Qigong practitioners to be aware of. And I started to sort of go into that, which in some ways speaks to the psychology of Chinese, of Qigong particularly. And then movement therapy, which there is a lot of information about movement therapy out there, but quite clearly Qigong has some quite core features in its practice that are quite unique. things like slow, smooth, continuous, relaxed. And luckily, there is quite a good body of research into that from the Tai Chi perspective. I spent from about 24 to about my mid-30s, just slowly and surely just bringing in more and more information about this. And part of that reason was I was actually teaching with you, Pete, the Qigong diplomas, and invariably would just get questions about this stuff. People would just say, why is wave arms like cloud good for the digestion? And, I would sort of find myself sort of thinking, from a TCM perspective, it has functionality within the middle jiao. We're going to be free coursing and moving chi there. But, how would I describe that from a biological standpoint? And so the goal was initially just to improve my communication skills, to be able to answer questions like that from a biomedical perspective, not just from a TCM perspective, and to sort of really understand clinically, how do I apply Qigong movements and systems to particular disease and disorder states that I see in clinic? Because importantly, Chinese medicine has 4 parts. The most well-known part, acupuncture and herbs, yeah. And then we've got Tuina, the massage techniques and bone setting, and Qigong. And to date, I still believe that Qigong is the most underutilized modality out of those 4 in clinical settings, yet probably the most important one, because all of the other modalities require a physician to do something to you, which is very different from self-empowering and doing something to yourself. And I know from a clinical perspective that if I have patients that are self-initiating their healthcare and recovery, they always do better. Guaranteed.
I totally agree, Pete. It is. And you brought up a really interesting point about it gives people responsibility for their own health instead of seeking help from somebody else to fix them or fix people. It gives you an opportunity to take control over your own wellness. And I think it's such an important thing to do as a practitioner. I'm always encouraging people to do it for themselves. The body wants to heal itself anyway. All we're doing is encouraging you and your own mind to want to heal yourself as well. And you have to do that in various ways. Just go back to for most people, I asked about the traditional Chinese for that 200 hours. So a lot of the stuff you talked is a really, really high level than what you actually teach during the first one, because I just don't want to scare people off because in the first level 1 course, it's an introduction into understanding the mechanism of what you're talking about. And maybe I'll get you to just talk about the level 1 level, because where you went there, and people go, whoa, how am I going to hold all of those 4? But well, just know that this is part of it. But the level 1's an introduction to get your head around to understanding a certain terminology, a certain understanding of that. Could you just talk to the level 1 aspect of that, and so people can get a glimpse of what that looks like?
Yeah, I don't want people to be scared of me. I know that we get a little bit excited. But importantly, when I'm sharing the story about, why I've researched this and created this content, I think we can talk a little bit broad view there. But when we get down to the 200 hours, the learning outcomes are actually quite simple, which are to be able to understand the foundational core functional restorative mechanisms of Qigong. And what we mean by that is when we think about posture, which is such a core feature of the practice, how does that benefit us? How does that restore functionality to our body? And so for us to understand that, there's just a couple of key things we need to know, which is a little bit about the anatomy of it. So how does sort of posture just work? Like how do we actually do that? Which we cover in a pretty foundational way. What are the core features of the practice in the context of setting that up? And then what is the outcome? How does that improve our quality of life in some way? And so what we do is we just actually go through posture, breathing, mind, and movement, and we just look at the foundations of its anatomy, its physiology, how it functions, and what the endpoint outcome of that is. And to achieve that, we have to certainly learn a little bit of anatomy, which is important. So we keep that, just nice and basic to some of the core structures in the brain that we're going to be sort of utilizing as we talk. Talk a little bit about peripheral anatomy of the nervous system a little bit, which I think is, again, just useful information from any practitioner's perspective. And then diving into how we influence those key structures and functions through posture, breathing, mind, and movement. And importantly, when you're doing the 200 hours, you're going to be learning the Shibashi, which I sort of see as a core foundational Qigong practice for everyone to learn. And so I tend to focus quite a lot on drawing information from those movement sequences because we are already going to learn the Chinese medical reasoning behind the functions of those movements. And therefore, we can tie that functionality down to some of the core features of its posture, the type of breathing techniques that are utilized, how it affects our quality of mind, and meditative effects, and then, of course, the actual core movement features themselves. So the way that I would probably simply describe it is a study of the anatomy, physiology, and functionality of Qigong from a modern biomedical perspective, and specifically looking through it from a neuroscientific lens, the study of the nervous system. And I have purposely chosen that system because of its inherent overlap with what we sort of see from a Chinese medical perspective. But also, when I did this research, I keep coming back time and time again to the fact that Qigong is essentially a non-invasive sensory surface stimulation that helps to regulate the functionality of our nervous system. We're utilizing sensations visually through audition, audits, and sound. We're using sensation of our body in the context of proprioception, like where are my limbs in space and time, sensations coming in. And when we dive into the research, what we discover is those effects through sensation are what really cause things like changes in our heart rate, changes in our respiratory volume, improving, joint mobility and functionality, and these fascinating effects on the brain, which I just, personally speaking, we could probably spend the rest of our careers just studying that part and still not get to the bottom of that rabbit hole. So it is really important that we recognize in level one that what we're trying to do there is to sort of open Pandora's box a little bit, just to have a wee look into what is Qigong and how do we observe its functional effects on the human organism. And the other core learning outcome is to improve communication skills. The reason why I made that an important learning outcome is invariably, particularly in the teacher's training, although it's not only for teachers, of course, many students potentially may go on to do some Qigong teaching. And I think if we have a little bit of understanding of how to describe some of those mechanisms in common biomedical terminology, that can be really useful in class dynamics and in communication with others as well. So I think helping to give us a language to utilize when communicating with other students or referring physicians or anyone who may have interest in the effect of Qigong on the body. And what we did to make sure that that is achievable in the timeframes that we have is we actually broke the lecture series down into essentially a lecture per system. So we'll do some anatomy and physiology just to get some of the language dynamics down first of all, understand the structures that we're going to be looking at, and then we'll dive into that by looking specifically just at posture, breath, mind, and movement, and the core features that belong to each of those individual regulating methods.
Very cool. So that's well described. I think it's a fascinating part of the 200-hour teacher training to go into this way of the perception of the exercise itself, not just the physicality or just doing the exercise and you breathe in, breathe out. It's about a little bit more of the technical aspect of what's actually happening inside the exercise. And I think it's really useful for anybody to know why when you're doing something, to know why you're doing it, but know what's actually happening while you're doing it. I think it's a great piece, and I really love having your input into the 200 hours and bringing this look, this view, I don't say view, this understanding of that part of the traditional Chinese medicine and that part of how the energetics affecting our body in a more of a clinical way and a more of a biomedical way, that so people can hold on to it easier, because sometimes TCM can be a bit far away from people's, because it's got its own language, it has its own thing. Not that neuroscience doesn't have its own language too, but it just to make it more simple, make it accessible to understand if you're going to do Qigong, because as you said, it's not everybody wants to become teachers, and even though it's a teacher's training, some people just do the practice because they just want to, take their own practice to a higher level. But it just brings their own practice to such a different level of understanding of what's actually happening. It's fascinating, and I can't thank you enough for your, as people can hear, your enthusiasm. I just love your enthusiasm and what you do, and your excitement you get about this. I love that. I love that you get excited about it and want to share that with people, and that just dwells well in our course, because it's all about the excitement. It's all about understanding who we are as a human being, and then how do we keep the mechanism, how do we keep our body well, how do we keep our mind well, how do we keep ourselves well in our lives, and how do we have a better life, happier life, and a better existence. And you're such an integral part of helping people understand who we are, and I cannot thank you enough for that, Pete.
It's a pleasure.
I'm looking forward to the 200 hours again. We're coming up
too, buddy.
Again, so I'm looking forward to hanging out with you again, and we have more discussions. And let's if we can, let's go back to this and talk a little bit more. Let's have some other discussions, and we'll talk about our particular subject, and we'll throw some ideas around, because we both have our own way we're looking at things, and it's nice to put the correlation together of how the two of them and how they meet in the middle. I think it's fascinating, and that's why I love chatting with you, because of the integral piece of connection that we have on a very different plane. But it's the same thing. It's just a different way of looking. It's a different way of looking at the pink elephant. It's still the elephant, though. We're just looking at it a slightly different way to try and make some sense out of it, to try and make some understanding, so we can understand this extraordinary vessel that carries us around, whatever this thing is, that carries our soul around. It's an extraordinary experience in life. And I love it that we get to share our knowledge around that, and to try and unlock the secrets, or it's not actually secrets, it's actually in plain sight, to understand what it is. It's not as though it's hidden. It's just, it's hidden sometimes in the classics, because it wasn't hidden. It was written down in plain sight. It was just the understanding was hidden, because not everybody can understand what they were really saying. It's like now, if you talk about some things and you know them really well, and you know them very well, but other people can't hear your language. They don't understand it to understand it. But for a person who does understand it, they go, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And so they put it there in a simple form that we can all get to it if we understood the language that they talk. And we're trying to understand what they were really saying, and what they were really hinting at, what they were really trying to show us. That's lasted forever, and it's not going away. It's still there, and it's still all about life. It's still all about the functionality of this thing, and it's a fascinating study.
Paradigms like that we can look at things through can often actually enhance our understanding significantly. When I read the classics like the Huangdi Neijing, the Ling Shu, the Su Wen, with all of my neuroscientific training, and I just put that lens on briefly while I'm reading it, you just suddenly sort of think, oh man, these guys were really astute anatomists. They had an
Exactly.
amazing
Exactly.
understanding of where things were. I mean, they named and labeled all the organs wet and dry, and none of that labeling has changed
No, exactly.
since 2,500 years
That.
ago. And when I started to view Chinese medicine through this paradigm, what really happened to me personally was validation.
Mm.
It helped to really validate the mechanisms of the different modalities that we utilize. And I think particularly because I was sort of came through part of the acupuncture industry where, you know, we were pretty much, and still are to be fair, in certain parts of the world on the fringe of the medical industry, not overly well accepted. I felt a lot of practitioners and students that I was teaching sort of had a lack of confidence in themselves because they were like, oh, you know, but, you know, we're never going to be accepted by Western medicine. They just don't understand. But what I've found to be true, because I work in a medical center with 40 nurses, 20 GPs, and 15 specialist groups. So I'm just surrounded by biomedical practitioners. And I can tell you right now, when I'm out the coffee cart chatting to them and talking to them about what we can do with our needles and our Qigong, they're fascinated by it. And they know that we need these types of modalities to be integrated in. And what I started to realize by looking at Chinese medicine through this paradigm is confidence. Because what it really taught me, it was like, right, they were right onto it with their anatomy and their physiology. They really understood the body, both at that Jing sort of essence and physical level, right through to the Shen, the spiritual and psychological level. They had modalities to interact with the human organism at all of those different levels, and they had a very astute understanding of the functionality of those inputs with the knowledge that they had at the time. So for me, the paradigm has enhanced my efficacy as a physician, not only to be able to communicate, but also clinically in how I work with patients, really imbued a confidence in myself around being a Chinese medical practitioner and healer, but also inspired me to sort of get out there and share that knowledge with people. Because I will remind you, Pete, you may have forgotten this, but when you got in touch with me to start teaching the 200 hours, it was about maybe 2 years before you ran the first one, and you got online with me and you said, I'm going to run this 200-hour retreat. And I was like, oh, that sounds amazing. You know, I'd love to come along and check that out. And he goes, I want you to teach on it. And I actually said to you, oh, no, I'm not teaching anymore. I've retired from teaching and I'm just focusing on my family and clinic now. And you gave me the same words that Tunji gave me many years earlier, which is, no, that's a really bad idea. I think you should teach. Hence why I started actually putting all of this knowledge and content around those 4 regulating methods down into something that was actually teachable. And then, you know, with your guidance, whittling that back even further so it wasn't something too scary. And here we are today, you know, with multiple runs of this course now. And to be fair, I think we've refined it down to a really beautiful piece of content that will certainly enhance the students' experience of their Qigong practice and how they experience it, which I'm very grateful for you pulling me out of retirement. So thanks for that, Pete.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm very glad I pulled you out. I mean, you can't hide, or you can. You can hide anything, but I don't want you to hide the piece that you have, that you can offer into the world, your knowledge, your understanding, your kindness, your generosity, and not share that with the world. I think it's such an important part, and there's something that, and it would be a shame to hide that from the whole world. And I saw that because I saw that in you when we first met. There was this why we got on so well. We're like kindred spirits. We're similar, and there's just part of you just needs to. Your soul needs to be able to communicate this because it's your gift. And it's lovely to
Yeah,
watch
thank
you
you.
share your gift and listening to you. I just love your passion. So I just want to leave it there so we could go on forever
Yeah,
chatting.
cool.
I just want to thank you,
Yeah.
Pete, for giving us some time today. And I know you're a busy man like myself. And I just want to thank you for your input. And it's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to hang out with and work with you. It inspires me all the time to keep going, to keep learning, to keep growing. No, I inspire you to keep teaching. Well, you inspire me to keep teaching as well. So and
Right.
not only teaching, but to keep learning, to keep asking the question, just to understand it more and more and more, so we can understand who we really are in our journey,
Yeah.
who we are as a human being. And it just inspires me, your part of it, and inspires me to keep looking at my part, so that we can pass on what we learn to other people, to make some sense out of this, and to try and help people get out of sometimes the states that they've got into that are not serving them, their dysfunction, their unwellness, and how we can help people get out of that so they can have a better quality of life, a better experience in life. And I know there's some people that have some hardships and they're born into some very difficult environments. But how do we change the mindset? How do we change it so that we, even through the darkest times, there's always light? How do we always can see the light? And I think the two of us, our goal is to help people see the light. And I mean,
Absolutely.
to see that you can have a better life. And you've done it for yourself. I mean, look where you came from with your unwellness as such, and you've changed your whole way you are, and because of your dedication to practice, for one, and your search for knowledge to understand why. And that's why it's so important that you pass it on, that you're a walking example of it working. And it's so important.
Yeah.
It comes from your
Totally.
wisdom. It doesn't come from you reading a book. It comes from your own life experience. And I think that's one of the most strongest, most powerful teaching ability to have it, because you're talking about your experience. And I think that's such an important thing, because it makes it very true. And so thank you for that, Pete.
Qigong's just been so informative in my life journey, both for my health, well-being, and spirituality. So much of the insight that I'm looking forward to sharing at the 200 hour just comes from the practice, the doing part, which is actually the most important piece, as you say, that daily practice, which is the key feature. And, ultimately speaking, it's that practice that's opened up our relationship, the relationships that we've had with all these, to be fair, tens of thousands of patients that we've all worked on, and students that we've taught. And, I couldn't be more grateful, Pete, for our friendship and time together, and just really looking forward to getting over to Bali soon and plugging in, doing some big, deep practices together, sharing these insights, and hanging out in our community. There's just nothing as good as stepping into that circle and gonging in together as a community and practicing together. So I just can't wait, buddy. It's going to be great.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to seeing you too and hanging out as well. So thank you for that.
Cool.
And yeah, thank you for your time. And it's been a pleasure to chat with you again. And I'll see you very soon. I'm looking forward to catching up with you again. And
Choice.
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you. Your soul and my soul were always meant to meet, and we were always meant to hang out. And we'll probably be hanging out to the day we die. So it's a very special time. Thank you. Thank you for being part of my life. Yeah.
That's
cheers.
a pleasure, buddy.
And thank you to everybody else. Thank you for coming to the podcast. Thank you. I hope you found that interesting. And I can't encourage you enough to keep learning about life, about learning about yourself, learning about life, and learning about wellness, and learning about how you can have joy and happiness in your life and have a better life. And but hopefully with the understanding of this and the bit more like Pete's talking about, we can have a deeper understanding of why we are who we are and how we can have a better version of that. Anyway, all the best, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. See you later, everyone. Bye.